Thank you, Rotem, and I'm very pleased to invite Omer Aloni, whom everyone here, I suppose, know.
I'm just taking it not for as a self-PR, but because of film staff asked me to, so it's not.
Okay, so Omer is a PhD candidate here at the Zvi Midas Center for Advanced Legal Studies, and he holds an LLM magna cum laude as well as an LLB and BA in General History from Tel Aviv University. His thesis that is written under the supervision of Professor Ron Haris dealt with Orientalist reflections in early Israeli law. And in his PhD dissertation, he joins the Renaissance on the study of the League of Nations, on which he will tell us a little bit now, during the last decade, and it focuses on environmental aspects and perspectives of the institution. He writes this study under the supervision of Dr. David Shore, and we're very much happy to have you here. No, this one.
Oh, okay, thanks. Okay, I do hope you hear me. So, first of all, thanks a lot, Doreen, and also, if I may, thank the organizing committee, not of me, but thanks a lot to Yael and to Doreen, and of course I want to thank Dr. David Shore, who guides me as my supervisor here, although the responsibility for any mistakes is my own. So I want to start with a short remark of Rotem, because Rotem, you were mentioning of the failure of during your first sentences of your presentation, of the failure of the League of Nations, and I want to try and tackle a little bit this kind of PR or this kind of cliche we have over the League of Nations, and so I'll try to be brief. So, at the heart of the flourishing historical study of the League of Nations in recent years lie questions regarding the centrality and importance of the League to the history of the world in the first half of the 20th century. These new studies seek to re-evaluate the League's influence on the international arena even beyond 1945 and the establishment of the League's successor, meaning the United Nations. In many ways, it seems that only today, and after decades of harsh critical historiography that has governed the post-1945 era research, has our view of the League of Nations become illuminated with bright new perspectives, in contrast to the dimmer view taken of it for almost half of a century. In my study, I would like to join this research renaissance and perhaps even expand its reach from both historical, legal, and sanitation environmental aspects. I shall examine the ways in which this institution influenced and regulated or tried to regulate the relationship between nature, environment, and the community. This between the years 1919 and 1939, through this perspective of legal analysis. And we know how the story ends, because we know that at the end we have the Second World War, but let us try to stay with the perception of the 20s and the 30s in Europe and even beyond. So I shall also seek to identify the motivation and the political patterns within the League which took place in this acclaimed environmental and sanitation regime, and to understand the ways in which the League was ahead of its time in preparing the post-World War II international arena in the direction of the now familiar and current global environmental regime. If I were to draw, and that's what I'm going to do in a short discussion, so if I were to draw a raw outline of the common historical perception of the League, I would say it has described Geneva of the interwar period as a failed capital of early internationalism, and the movement itself, meaning the seek for institutional environmental movement or agenda, so the movement itself as naive or unrealistic. Due to the repeated the repeated accusation of its failing to prevent of the horrors of the Second World War, other activities of the League, besides peacekeeping and collective security, which were the main two of the main goals of the League of Nations, so other activities of the League have remained relatively untouched by scholars until recently. However, research in the archives of the institutions that created this first fundamental global international regime reveals other different aspects that can interest scholars of many disciplines of environmental studies. The spirit of Geneva, as Susan Peterson, which I hope Doreen would accept or agree that she's one of the founding mother of the studies of the League of Nations. So the spirit of Geneva, as Susan Peterson was suggesting, had in fact dedicated much of the League's international efforts, resources, and energy to the fight against various and horrible diseases and plagues that threatened the global community. The discussions in the Palais des Nations dealt, apart from issues of international security and fundamental minority problems or questions, with intensive reports and increasing scientific medical actions that were intended to cope with serious outbreaks of plagues in different cities and areas all around the world. As Katarina Webse describes it, the phase of peace in the 20s and the 30s, and especially in the early 20s, and the general atmosphere of the pity of war, as Neil Ferguson was describing, gave the League a vast range of opportunities with which to engage. And I want to quote Katarina Webse. A result of the Paris Peace Conference, the conference that gave the world the League of Nations in 1990, so the result of the Paris Peace Conference, the League embodied an unprecedented attempt to lead the world into the phase of peace, justice, and international cooperation. For almost any social movement interested in extending its national scope, the League appeared to be the ideal forum for putting an issue on the global agenda. Flipping through the League registry gives the impression that the organization felt responsibility and competence to deal with almost any aspect of modern society. Among pressing problems such as the modern slave trade, forced migration, minority rights, and drug trafficking, the League dealt with environmental conflicts too. End of quote. Starting from its very first steps and during its formative years of the early 20s, the League of Nations became increasingly involved in vast international missions to fight against the spread of disease almost all around the world. These joint efforts can interest many scholars of the quite similar international campaigns of our own time, as we can learn much today from the fears of different communities, center and periphery alike, in various geographical regions, from Eastern Europe, for example, to the Balkans, to the Middle East, and also to the Far East, as it was called by diplomats of the period. There appeared to have been a gap between the core of the planned international law and the ways in which it was applied, and the mission for it was enlisted. And I'm using enlisted because the jargon that some of the diplomats in Geneva use for the fights or for the campaigns against the spread of disease are really military ones. They are talking about intelligence and campaigns and to be enlisted to this kind of missions. So this they was enlisted during the interwar period. This gap between the planned and the actual functions of the League, so this gap reflected in various intensive and very ambitious campaigns to address those humanitarian concerns that were not the official main goals of the League of Nations, or it was as expected to deal with in the early stages. Indeed, the League was not set to deal with epidemic problems, as these were considered as separate from the interactions between domestic law, international law, institutional structure, and internationalism in the optimistic era that has captured Europe and other political centers of the international sphere, when the Paris Peace Conference of summer 1990 gave the League to the bleeding heart world after the horrors of the Great War. In this short discussion, I will tackle two main issues that I'm studying while reading and analyzing hundreds of documents, paper, correspondence, reports, memoranda, and publications engaging with the early and fierce epidemic entanglements that concern the diplomatic milieu in Geneva in regard to Europe and also far beyond the continent. The first issue concerned the background of the League anti-epidemic intensive approach, while the second one presents a short discussion of how might a legal historical interpretation can explain the particular expansion of the League's tasks and roles. Regarding to the first issue, before the current modern concerns of SARS, FMD, which is foot and mouth disease, HIV, and MDR tuberculosis, it was all threats such as malaria, typhus, plague, and other semi-biblical diseases that posed what came to be one of the greatest and unpredictable challenges with which the League had to deal with from its optimistic birth in Paris of 1990. The first question I want to address does concern the reasons behind the fact that the League, throughout its 2 decades of ruling internationalism in the interwar period, became increasingly involved in fighting the massive waves of disease. One might find an interesting reflection of the historical cordon sanitaire also in the work of the League. The geographical and the geopolitical belt that theoretically shielded Europe and its inhabitants against the spread of disease or political ideologies, as the French Prime Minister Georges Clément referred in a formal public announcement in March 1990, So the League was also afraid from the dangerous communist frontier beyond the borders of Western Europe and its political regime. So we can see it's also reflected in Geneva. What the Austro-Hungarian Empire had already tried to defend its walls in Vienna, meaning the epidemic threats of the Ottoman Empire, and what Clemenceau was credited for it's his first use of the phrase in regard to West European need for a defensive union in Eastern Europe, and as a barrier against the Soviet Russia. That can be also interpreted or studied also from the discussions, delegations, and actions taken by the League to fight against the spread of these diseases. This issue clearly raises a parallel with the League's early steps and fears from what to become the Cold War in the era after World War II, and the deepening involvement of the League with campaigns against the various diseases that were advancing, almost in concert on the historical timeline. The fear that European population centers, and especially the major cities, would be affected by plagues from the East were intensively and increasingly debated and discussed in Geneva, both in the General Assembly. I want to show you some pictures. So both in the General Assembly and in the Council of the League. These are two of the main institutions within the League. The spirit of Geneva, the optimistic and hopeful atmosphere that governed the legal discourse of the League, sometimes seems to be a contradiction or challenge to this kind of bitter missions it was facing. However, in certain other aspects, the huge financial efforts and time resources that the League and its organ has invested in fighting disease contributed to the belief, that's what I'm trying to claim, so it's contributed to the belief in the power and resilience of international law. That is why in other aspects, the Secretariat of the League, for example, included the first Secretary General himself, Eric Drummond, sometimes struggled to prevent the drowning of the League, its personnel, and its budget in different catastrophic areas, both in rural and urban areas, which call upon Geneva to rescue them. Studying the patterns in which the League engaged in this campaign against disease also enable us to raise and ask current relevant research questions that related to other dimensions in history and in understanding of the League. In many ways, the establishment of the League of Nations also marked the ground zero of other institutions and international organizations connected to the core in Geneva. During the years of the operation, growing major technical international agencies gained more and more power, affecting the international map in a unique and unprecedented way. Within a relatively short period of time, arose a group of institutions such as the Permanent Court of International Justice, for example, or the World Health Organization of Rachel Eleanor Crowdy, and the Organization of Communication and Transportation. So we have a very short period of time when in the 20s and the 30s that bring into the front or into the center of internationalism a few very important organizations that dealt with international law. So within a relatively short period of time, these kind of institutions, all of which became affiliated with the League of Nations, and which played a leading role in creating, defining, and shaping international law in one of its most important moments. With the exceptions of its two main original goals, maintaining the global peace and the collective security, and promoting the concept of the state sovereignty, these were the three main goals of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was required, particularly in the turbulent interwar period, to handle various acute humanitarian problems, and that's why I'm calling it the humanitarian monsters, because some of the milieu in Geneva, or the personnel, and especially as I mentioned, the Secretary General himself, were very reluctant or afraid of this kind of spreading of the League of Nations to area which it was not meant to handle with. So. And it has to handle with acute humanitarian problems and large-scale superstate issues of the type that international arena, whether through enacted international law or even if with its absence, had not yet experienced. So I have 2 more minutes, so quick brief. I want to show you. These are the League of Nations, and the archives are located in this in this wing. And I want to show you some papers and documents from the archives themselves. Just a sec. So this is, for example, a very interesting conference taking 2 years. The date, if you can see, it's over here. It's in August 1937. It's exactly almost 2 years minus 1 month before World War II, and a lot of the energies and resources of the League of Nations dealt with a very big international conference of Far Eastern countries on. They call it rural hygiene, and they were dealing with with the fear of spreading disease from the Far East towards Europe. They had delegations from all around the world, from Britain, from Burma, from Ceylon, China, Fiji, Hong Kong, India, and all sorts of other countries in the region. And it's very interesting to see the connections or the interactions between the imperial or the superpowers and these countries in the Far East or in Southeast Asia. And if I want to focus with, and I'm finishing, Lorraine, with a connection to environmental aspects, for example. So these are photos taken by the delegations or the experts, the scientific experts that were discussing in this conference that was taking place in Bandung. So this, for example, they describe, if you can read it, so the pollution of water sources with night soil contaminants. So this was taken in China. And another one, this, for example, is the anti-plague works in the village street in South Manchuria. So, and this is, I mean, if we think about the last years of the 30s, Europe is dealing with the rise of fascism, but the League of Nations is giving a lot of attention and resources and energy to deal with this kind of fears that was supposed to threat Europe in this period of time. So thanks a lot.